Well, I'd just like to start off by saying just a few words about how this kind of seminar came together, really, and a little bit about my background. Michael and I kind of know each other. Michael Knoll, who unfortunately can't be here today, but I've got Michael Donahue, that's at the back, from Oracle. I actually run the company, which is KHL Interactive, which was mentioned by Jonathan earlier on. I've done quite a lot of work with OLM, but my kind of background is that I used to be IT manager for Nokia Data, and then I moved on to working for Computer Center. I think there's a couple of people from Computer Center that were supposed to be here. Hi. For about 6 years for my sins at Computer Center. Wonderful company to work for. Great things that you can do in that organization. I did leave to work for a large American company for a few years, and then I thought, well, I'm making a lot of money for other people. Let's see if I can start a company and lose money, or actually try my best to help other people in other ways. So I started out that company. And then Michael and I were talking about 2008 with regards to OLM and getting OLM to work within McKesson and the NHS. And quite honoured to work with some of the people there and wrote some of the documentation. So you can blame me for the fact that if you need to look at your PCT documentation, my name's in there as one of the authors for having to get that thing to work. And I have to say that in the early days it was quite difficult to establish the integration part. That's only because with every project you've got to get your definitions right, and you've got to understand what you're trying to do with it. And we helped out with McKesson and the NHS team, and they've done a great job so far in terms of getting that thing to integrate quite well. Now we are talking about the NHS specifically, which is the ESR program, the Employee Staff Record, which is based on the Oracle system, and Oracle also have OLM, which actually slots in. I won't steal Jonathan's thunder because he is going to talk about some of the other learning management systems that are out there. But just as a kind of a straw poll, how much are you aware about the kind of SCORM environment? Because I don't want to make this presentation too technical or even kind of too light in terms of what you're actually looking for. I had a quick look at the expectations for people for today, and it seemed to be that it was across the board, that some people knew about SCORM quite well, and some people are in the early stages getting to understand how to track data and to use it properly. So as a straw poll, are you quite used to kind of the term SCORM? Do you know what it can do? No? No? Okay. All right, okay, wonderful. Okay. That can be a good thing and it can be a bad thing. Okay. So let's carry on. So what I thought I'd do is actually go back a bit and actually explore just very quickly an overview of what SCORM actually is, but really from a practical perspective rather than give you a technical detail about what opens and what closes when you're actually talking to these particular systems. And also one of the other things to look at is to actually look at it from, because the whole point of this presentation is about best practice. So what have other companies done, or what have other people done, not necessarily health, but in other areas where they've commercially applied the concepts of SCORM in order to get efficiency. And I think the key word here is that compliance, and we'll go into what SCORM actually stands for, does give you efficiency, especially when it comes down to course design. And as Jonathan mentioned, one of the things that we're quite kind of au fait with is to actually bring out the best of content, but not to kind of develop content and then develop it again and develop it again, and therefore you've got millions of copies of videos and other things. The whole point of sharing content is that you can spread it across. One of the great parts of John's presentation, that John Morris's presentation, was the fact that when you come into a portal, there are other periphery bits of information that you need as well. For example, understanding how to use the system. You could have a little video for that, or access to HR information. HR information may not be available in the learning management modules, but it may be something that's kind of more up to date. So you may want to build a portal which has got an RSS feed, which actually updates continuously all the latest information to do with the actual subject area. But I'll come into that later on. So the second thing I'm going to look at is I'm going to look at course design, but with specific examples, and we're going to look at some case studies as well. So that's kind of the format for my presentation, not a million slides. Let's go first of all into SCORM. Now, we can develop a website, anyone can develop a website, and that will contain audio, video, text, image, or it can be flat. But the whole point of this particular SCORM environment was that it was going to be efficient, it was going to be interoperable, which means it could work between one learning management system and another. That's a theory. Okay, so if you've got something like Moodle or you've got OLM, if they're both SCORM compliant, they've been wrapped so that you can actually get the content to move across, then you've only built it once. But we know from using these systems there's a slight bit of tweaking that you need to do. But I think the other thing is about accessibility as well. So I know that a recent project that we did, we actually developed not only a Flash version, but also a HTML version. And can it be read by Browse Aloud? Can it be read by JAWS? And there is a government requirement from September from a few years ago that everything you develop must be accessible. But the limits of that accessibility are to be defined, I think. And it also depends on your audience. Sure. Right. Okay. Yeah, kind of. One way of looking at it is to say that you develop content, and that content could be a website, or it could be a set of modules, or what we call them sessions. So a session of learning might be 20 minutes of learning. Right? So when you look at your course, you might say, well, actually, if I split it up into these chunks, I've actually got these table of contents associated with that learning. Or I might have one chapter, and it's got 4 or 5 sections to it. Now, the SCORM part is the fact that you actually wrap it up so that it can actually sit inside the learning management system. So it can be controlled, allocated, and measured. That's what the SCORM does for you. So it will, if you ran the content on its own, that's fine, that's wonderful. But if you wrapped it with a wrapper, which I'll go into in a minute, then what it will do is it will allow it to sit inside a learning management system, or it will allow it to sit on a content server remotely and be called upon. That's the difference. Is that a bit clearer? Yeah. Absolutely. Let me give you a real practical example. Say, for example, I'm the student and you're the tutor, and I need to do a course. Okay, so you as my tutor will allocate the course to me. Okay, but you'll do that through an administration panel, but the course actually sits inside OLM as a module. The only way that it's going to sit inside OLM is if it's actually wrapped in a SCORM wrapper. Okay, now the SCORM wrapper consists of those 3 elements known as the manifest. The first thing is the organization of the course, for example, the chapter headings, the sections, the modules. The second part is metadata, and metadata is a wonderful word. What the hell does that mean? Metadata is information about information. It seems to be the thing that most people forget about when they develop a course. It's actually about understanding that when you produce a video, or when you take, did you know that if you go to a concert and you take a photograph, if you take that photograph with your own personal camera, with your own time, and you own the actual prints for it, or the digital prints, you are the copyright owner of that particular photograph. Right? If I interview you, for example, for a video shoot on a one-to-one interview, I've got to get your permission, so I've got to get consent. Okay, so all of that information is really kind of into an asset database. So you can't just go into Google Images and nick the pictures and put them into your e-learning. And if you did, if you went to Getty Images or you went to iStock Photo and you took the image and you paid for the educational copyrights for it, you'd obviously parted with money. You've got access to use it. But when the image needs to be changed, then you might need to record that. So all that information goes into an asset database, which you could keep on a spreadsheet or a separate system. And it is amazing when you go out onto the internet that there's nothing that exists at the moment to help you keep track of the fact that you've got all these assets. So when you've got your e-learning and you've got video, audio, image, text might be your own. Every single element of that, even if it's a PowerPoint presentation that you've enabled with an OLM, has got a copyright owner and has got a history and an archiving associated with it. So that's what metadata actually is. So when you actually wrap this content that you develop, this wonderful course using this rapid e-learning tool, you will need to keep reference to all the little bits and pieces that you've used to develop the course. So I know I'm kind of blowing it up and saying how difficult it is, but if you're challenged and someone says, well, actually I recognise that picture, it's a picture of a director, but you didn't get the director's permission, and the director's in the company, and the person actually leaves, and that content lives and lives and lives in maybe 2-3 years, then obviously either it gets out of date, or that individual's grown a moustache or a beard or whatever. You know, the actual life of that asset needs to be respected. So let's move on. So talking more about the data. So what you do is you run a process, it's called packing. Okay, so you develop your course and you pack it. You can use lots of tools that are out there. Oracle got some great tools. There are public tools as well, open source tools like Reload that you can get. And once it packs, it actually generates this file called an IMS manifest file. And what that is an XML file, and it produces a zip file. And that zip file is what you point OLM to import the entire course into OLM, if you decide to sit it inside OLM. Or you can unpack the tool and put it into a folder and actually give the URL to OLM, which is pretty cool, really, because you could have multiple content servers with courses on them with different URLs. There'll be two URLs that you need for OLM. One URL will actually reference the actual startup program to actually start up the screen. And the second one will be for the SCORM adapter, which will open up a separate window in the background, which will pass data, tracking data, directly into OLM. Any questions so far on that? So, really what the manifest file is doing is aggregating content. But the best way to look at it is that it contains specific information about the history of that content. It also contains the list of all the resources, like I used that video and it's called this, and I used that image and it's called that, and I've got a table of contents that says this bit of video is going to be used again in chapter 2. So it's got all that information. When you do this packing process, that's what's actually happening actually underground. And I think that really says it all, really. It says metadata may include descriptive information about the content itself. So how does it work? I'm not going to go into this in too much detail because of the question that I asked before about what you need to know about it. But there's 3 basic things you need to know. The first thing is that when you run OLM for the first time, that's great, it's sitting in the background, you've set your content up. But when you run your course for the first time, it actually goes out and it asks OLM a very interesting question. Hello, will you talk to me? So there's a little handshake that happens there. And that's where it opens that little invisible Java window in the background that you don't see, so that content can actually get, run. Secondly, data can actually get passed in terms of tracking data. And I'll come back to tracking data in a minute. So that's called the LMS get command. The second thing is the value. Now, I'll come on to that in a minute, but OLM has a fantastic ability to actually track 6 elements of the actual course. And I'll show you, I've got a slide for that as well. But when the actual session's finished, it passes another control mechanism, which is called LMS finish, which means, okay, I finished the session, I now need to kind of go to sleep and store it. And I'll give you an example. If you've got a book and it's got 10 chapters, and you're reading the book and you read it every night, and then eventually you get to, say, chapter 3, I always get told off for folding the page over in the corner rather than using a proper marker, or actually one of those little book, what do they call those things? A book leaf, isn't it? The good old days, a little leather book leaf that you could have, and that preserves. And obviously, a bit of a problem when the book leaf actually falls out. And I say, well, you should have folded the page over, shouldn't you? But that's effectively what's actually happening here. You're setting a little pointer to say, when I come back in next time, I actually was at chapter 3. Can I carry on? And any data that's been passed through in terms of the fact that it actually took me 5 minutes to read 3 chapters because I'm a fast reader. Or it would be basically 4 or 5 other people who aren't necessarily as fast readers. They've got their own session running, but we'll know by looking at measurements, and again going back to John about statistics or reporting, we can go in and say, well, if I look at the progress of my little group that I got allocated a certain amount of content to, I know that that person's quite steaming ahead. Maybe I need to give them something a little bit more challenging. So you're using the kind of management information that's actually within OLM to determine what's actually happening. That's only if you set up the content to track that level of detail. So if you just very quickly look at this diagram, this is what, if you kind of took the roof, the bonnet off and actually said, well, what's actually inside OLM? Well, you've got a number of elements. First of all, you've got this kind of registration area. That's kind of a common language that's used to actually say, well, we've got these candidates, or we've got these individuals, and this is where they are. You can do a bit of reporting and the data tracking, which I'll come back to in a minute. And within OLM also, you can do tests. So you don't have to actually have the content do the tests. You've actually got the system that can do the tests for you, which is pretty cool, really, because what you could do is if you had an old bit of PowerPoint, and you want to reuse it, you don't need to pack it. You just need to call it within OLM, and then you can design a set of questions within OLM. So there, you haven't even done any of the SCORM stuff. You're just actually reusing content that's actually there. So it doesn't necessarily have to be SCORM compliant. It could just run a piece of content. It could be a URL that directs you to a specific piece of content. And then over here, which is quite nice, is that you could have multiple servers. So you could have 4 or 5 servers. So if you were at a quite large organization and you had different departments who got their own servers, they could have their own e-learning and they'd have their own domain names. So all you do is just give the domain name to OLM and it would just call the program from there. But as long as it's wrapped up in SCORM and you've decided what you want to track, then that data will actually go into OLM. Does that make sense in terms of the flexibility of it? But let's have a look at the kind of tracking elements that you can actually have. Well, that was the example that I gave before, that if you've got to chapter 3 and it's 10 chapters, or look at it in terms of a table of contents, you've got a certain number of progress that you've got to make. What's interesting about some of the e-learning these days is that you actually get, I was looking at John's earlier on, is that you've actually got tabs at the bottom, so you could have, sections 1 to 3 or 1 to 6, or you could have like little tabs at the top, so they progress through them. So if it's quite a complex subject, and it's 20 minutes, the way I normally look at it in terms of a module or a session is think about it in terms of a 20-minute learning segment. So if it's 20 minutes on a page, or 20 minutes within 4 or 5 pages, so you might have a little bit of animation on one, or a little image on another, you might have a video on the other, but the whole thing is a session that gives you a bit of a knowledge bite. And people do tend to like the little breaking it down into knowledge bites. I think that's something that they kind of get on with, because otherwise it's just too much information. So that's the bookmarking bit. The second thing is the completion and incomplete. Now this is really interesting stuff, because you can actually do it with a percentage score. So you can set within your e-learning wrapping mechanism. So you develop the content, but when you wrap it, it will actually ask you when you do your tests, how much should the test actually be progressed to. So if you set the pass mark to 80%, they do the test at the end, and they pass the completion data directly into OLM. So when you're looking back at reporting, you can say, well, this person didn't do very well, they got to 60%, but they completed the course. Right? But if you look at the 6th one on the list, we could either set the suspension on or off, which means that are they allowed to redo the test, even though they only got to 60%? Okay, so you could argue that, well, actually, you don't get a chance to resit your GCSEs, do you? Well, you probably do after about 3 months, or you've got to wait a whole year. We'll take a gap year for the rest of our lives. How's that? But suspension's quite interesting, because again, that's something you've decided before you've actually set it up. And the difference between number 4 and number 5, another 2 sets of data that you can track, is that if it took me 5 weeks to do the course, you might think that's quite good, because you might say directed learning is about 30 hours. So 30 hours over 5 weeks is pretty cool. You could work it out. Now, the benefit of having it on a content server is that they can work from home, and they can log in, and they can actually get access to it, and it's keeping track all the time, and it's totaling up the total number of units that you've actually used. And it won't say to you, well, you should have taken 5 hours, but you took 6. It just adds it up. There's no limit that you're setting within there. But saying that, you may have also decided in your own course design that at least the average session should take about 20 minutes. So you can go back statistically and say, on average, this person tends to finish within 15 minutes. So maybe we need to kind of do something to the course. So again, it comes back to remediation or repurposing your content. It's quite lousy to leave content and never come back to it, because you need to continuously improve it and actually look at the value that's actually being brought about. Now that may be through feedback sessions, or like a little work group that you've got with a bunch of super power users, and say to them, well, you're quite a high ability user because you can thrash through this course, and another person who's actually quite a nice steady individual. So you have to take an average from that. Okay, let's move on. So course design, this was the second thing I really wanted to talk about. You'll notice on the right hand side, can you see the colours okay? Yeah? Over here we've got 3 courses that have been assigned. Now, they're quite nice courses, good courses for farmers actually. One course is on growing fruit trees. So I kept it really generic for the audience, And number 2 is a guide to produce. And number 3 is preparing fresh produce. So you could have lots of really nice menus and stuff for what you do with your food in terms of making apple pies or whatever. Now, what's really interesting, I keep saying interesting, is because if you look at the green, the common elements that come out are growing apples, the types of apples, and over here growing oranges and types of oranges. Now that has got a green element, so you can argue that it's all about growing trees, isn't it? But nothing on the right hand side in this content repository really applies. But it's actually quite different when you look at it from a guide to produce, because the purple actually applies to that one, and that one. And it also applies to type of lettuce, and cooking with peppers, and types of peppers. So you've got 2 content repositories that are shared in one particular course. And the beauty of doing this in terms of planning, and are there quite a lot of people here that get involved in instructional design, that kind of stuff? And when you talk to your instructional designer, it's important to say to them, can you just look at parallels and see which ones you could reuse? What's quite interesting about this one is that growing peppers is completely irrelevant to the whole thing. So somebody may have come across and said, well, what we'll do is do a course on this. And you'll go, actually, well, it's already covered somewhere else. Do you see what I'm saying? And then down here, in terms of preparing fresh produce, that's probably got the least number. But what's good about this is that what you could say is that there's a core course that you develop, which is common skills, right? And from that, you break it down into more specific skills. So that's another way of looking at that. And that's what we call kind of branching and global parameters to actually say, well, you've actually understood the concept. Now we can take you forward. Now, the case study I want to talk to you about very quickly is this one, which is the City of Bristol case study. This is one of our clients, KHO Interactive. Now, this is interesting in one context, is that they've got the learning management system here. But what they do is they pass a piece of data across that says that they've actually now completed the core learning. So in an environment where you've got set courses that you've got to run, and you've got to go through them. Everyone has to go through compliance. Everyone has to do health and safety, or everyone has to do diversity training, or everybody has to do, resuscitation of your fellow worker. That'd be quite a good one, wouldn't it? How to use a defibrillator. But once they've done that, there may be specific skills that you want to see whether they can actually exercise. Now, we're not saying that we're waiting for someone to have a heart attack so you can actually practice on that person. But first aid, and the number of first aid courses that I've been on, I just forget about them, and the next day I have to write notes continuously. I don't know what it is about first aid, but I never seem to remember all the bits and pieces. Apart from Radio 4 that said the other day that Nelly the elephant is the best way to do the rhythm of resuscitation, apparently. Depends on which version, of course. But over here, the learning management system, you've actually done the course, but how do you prove that the person's actually got the skills? So what you want to do is actually set up an e-portfolio. But what this will be evidence-based. So they're actually submitting their work online in a separate area. But in order to understand that they've actually got the skills to get to that point, they must have completed the core units first. So what we're doing is we're handing off. So we're saying, yeah, you've done the course material. We'll pass a data flag across to the e-portfolio, and the e-portfolio will now know that in order to prove fully that you understand this work, you've got to submit some examples. So let me give you an example. Here, somebody's going to learn about Word for Windows, okay, whatever version it is. And then, so great, you've done the course, but can you actually use the system? So we'd like you to do a document, and we'd like you to use paragraphs, and we'd like you to clip art and put some images in there, and we'd like to make sure that you can save it in different formats, okay? So that will be the portfolio. Now, the portfolio sits according to the candidate, and then the assessors come in and actually look at the evidence. So they get an email that says, by the way, there's a bit of work that's been submitted, and the actual candidate is no longer allowed to submit a replacement copy. So it's not like, oh my God, I've forgotten, I need to go off and replace it. Once you've submitted the example, that's it. And then you have an email that goes to the assessor logs into the account, checks the work and says, yes, it's passed. And then you might have an external moderator, which will be somebody that comes in and says, actually, not only did the student do a good job, but also the assessor did a good job as well. Then you might want to set up a batch process so that every 10 candidates over the next 6 months are checked to ensure that the assessor really is doing a good job and the course is actually working properly. And more importantly, the course that you originally designed over here in your OLM system or whatever you've got actually really focused in on the key issues, which again goes back to the fact that when you develop any of these courses, you need to understand the end game. Are you doing this stuff because you have to do compliance, or are you doing it because you really want to demonstrate that you've actually understood the course? And I know the term blended was used earlier on, but blending is extended further in terms of actually practical examples of them having actually proven that they're going to do a good job going forward. So there's no point in sending them on a course if it's out of time. How many people have been on a course where they already know the stuff and then they go on the course? So it's kind of mistimed. Or they're about to start in a new job, but they need to have those skills or the awareness of the actual project before they actually hit the floor running. So it's all about timing and then improving. Well, that's it for my bit. So I've kind of shown you some of the elements of SCORM in terms of the shared content objects, which are these objects that you've got to create so that you can actually ensure that you get an efficiency, right? The second thing that we looked at is the tracking. So you've got 6 core elements, and you don't have to use all 6. I know the NHS use 3 of them, which is quite good. The bookmarking stuff, the session time, the resume, all that great stuff does actually work. And it extends all the way in terms of reporting as well. So in the back end of ESR, it will kind of track that, ESR being employee staff record. We've been trying to look at the best practice in terms of course design. It's not just purely about the course being done and then forget about it. You've got to improve on that course, and then you've got to look at the stats as well to make sure it does actually work. And the integration piece is quite important, because you may just want to say, actually, I'm going to send a flag over and I'm going to get them to carry on doing some more work. Yeah. It's interesting, actually, there are some learning management systems that are now doing these podcast things, which are basically the fact that they can actually get a bit of additional learning. So they're not actually online, they're listening to content or they're watching content, and it's all associated with the actual course, so that when they do run the actual course itself, they're actually a lot more kind of aware of the concepts before they actually start, and they can do that in their own time. So important to look at periphery content as well that you can create. And you can improve on that, and that would be outside of OLM, but definitely something that you can look at. Metadata, I mentioned that the most important part, in my view, of content development or any course design is who wrote that text. And can we just kind of review it again, because it was quite complicated. Interesting concept in e-learning design is that when you develop your e-learning and you've got the text on your screen, do you actually get the program to read the text out to you, or should it be a summary? Now, there's the jury's out on that. From an accessibility perspective, the program's going to read the content anyway. But from a key concepts perspective, you might say, well, this is quite a lot of text, but the core 3 elements that you get from this session, which took you 25 minutes to do, are these core concepts. And you would have had them anyway, because you would have had the course outline. So that's an interesting way of looking at things. Secondly, the branching. So this means that I have all these skills before I start, but if I can't understand this, what additional e-learning can I do so I can actually get better and better at doing the course when I get to do it again, if I'm allowed to do the test again? And we looked at the fact that you can actually set your scores like 80% or 20% or whatever, or the bare minimum pass mark, the completion status, the fact that you can run it again and again and again, and it's not an issue for anyone, you know. But you may want to look at the timing, how long they're taking to actually do this stuff, because it might be pointing to the fact that the e-learning needs to be redone. And I won't steal John Turner's thunder with regards to repurposing. So sequencing, branching, these are all things that are part of the SCORM standard as it develops going forward. So you can see with OLM, you can do an integrated solution for e-learning. And secondly, it's not about, I would say, it's not necessarily about the technology. It is more about understanding what the purpose of doing that e-learning is, and how you keep that e-learning real, you know, for real, in terms of making sense with the individuals who are actually doing it, and the fact that they get the maximum gain when they've actually finished it, or they can recommend it to other people. And that's the kind of success criteria, is that when they've done the course, they go, I really enjoyed the course, it's got some really relevant stuff, I recommend it to other people. So thank you for your time. Any questions? Well, it's a very good question, because GSK, for example, they use a different system, and they have the same compliancy. And what they've done is they've categorized their workforce by different levels, and they say, well, all of this workforce, which is on this grade, has to do this compliance. But compliance, like health and safety and other things, changes all the time. So there isn't, unfortunately, an automated mechanism for that, but you'll have to do it through your administration records to see what year individuals passed. Well, there's version control within your content, within your separate database that's keeping track of what you changed, but there wouldn't be version control within the actual content once it's burnt. Now, the way you could do it is that on every screen you put a version number, and we've done that in the past as well. So if there are specific things that change, you know, and you can cross-reference that back to your asset database. But the OLM system wouldn't say, well, actually, that person did it and is now no longer compliant. You have to kind of have that within their employee record. So you might have to change the database structure so it says they've passed between this year and this year, and they must take these tests. And it automatically produces a report saying, well, these ones are out of date. But if the compliance said that every year you must do this test, so come January 1, you'll be sitting there, but the content will be up to date. So you're basically doing 3 things. You're doing administration, you're doing the content and keeping it up to date, and you've got your asset library that you're ensuring is kept up to date with all the actual items. The reason why the content thing is separate from the metadata is because that may be across multiple courses. Do you see what I'm saying? So it may not just be one, one-to-one. It could be one-to-many. It might store the fact that it's got version 3, but it wouldn't say, well, it was written on this date, and this person took the photograph, or this person took the video, or you need to renew that content on this date. Because the other thing you might want to do is you might in your database say, well, actually, this content is going to be valid for 6 months until I have a review period and I go back and change it. It's actually probably more important for old content that you want to kind of port across. So you might have some old courses, and traditionally what tends to happen is a lot of people have got old CDs, and they want to kind of take the content off and rip it, or the audio's actually changed, they need to re-record the audio, but some of the pictures are still okay. But you're going to have to keep a separate track of that. And as I said, I looked, like really hard on the internet, and I just couldn't find an asset library system anywhere,
But your LMS won't.
No, your LMS won't look at that. No, your LMS just runs the content, But it does, yeah. But the metadata that's in the IMAS manifest file will contain specific information, but it won't contain any archiving data or any history associated. It's not like Wikipedia, where you go into Wikipedia and you can look at the previous versions and you can look at the fact that somebody changed it, and that'd be pretty cool. One of the things you might want to do is you might want to create a wiki of your own, where you've actually got a list of all your content, and then you can keep track of the fact that that one I changed last week, and that was the person who changed it. The thing with organisations is that people leave and move on and do other great things. So you need to kind of keep reference to that. And it may also say, well, actually, I keep the master copy of this over there, and it is actually editable. Because that's the other thing as well, especially when it comes to video and audio. You can edit all this stuff, but at the end of the day, you need to go back to the original master to change it. Because it's a bit like, the way I look at it, it's a bit like apparently DVDs fade after a while, and so do videotape. So you probably need to keep somewhere, a safe location where no one can touch it. Or you have really tight controls and who's allowed to book it out, change it, and put it back in again. And we've had that in a lot of production processes where if you've outsourced your production to another company, how easy is it for the content with the other company to go out of sync with yours? Or have they got it in a content repository? This is why repositories are so important, because they're common locations where stuff actually sits. I would extend that as far as the instructional design as well. The instructional design should also have a version number on it too. And if you've got a wiki, or you've got things like Ning, which are great little networks that you can have, where people can come in and they can comment, you can actually go back and look at the history of what's actually happened to that content. And it can be quite good, because the next piece of e-learning that you develop, or content, you can say, well, actually, I don't need to do that video again. I've already got it there. Or I can splice this bit out, or I can use that image. So it all comes back to efficiency at the end. Or you might say, well, actually, it's a brand new concept. We're going to have a brand new piece of video content that we need to do. Let's go off and do that. And I mentioned before about the podcasting bit. We've got some additional elements that we need to help people. I mean, the big thing that's going on at the moment, I've got time here for this, but is more about collaborative learning, that you tend to learn more in a little group when you get together and talk to people, rather than necessarily online. So blended is good, but blended on another level is when you get collaboration happening, but you've got it around content. So you say, look, I'm going to do this course, but what do you know about it? Well, let's go to the website where we can learn about other people who've done it and what they've said. So that's a forum. There are forums that you can set up. Or, more importantly, you can have content which actually complements it. So you listen to maybe a 5-minute overview of the course that you've recorded as audio. Or you have a little video that says, well, I did the course and it was really good, and now I'm doing this. And it becomes inspirational to the learner. And then these are all, like, I call them periphery, but they're just as important to have that. Because, say for example, at your university or college, at school, I know there's the competitive forces about league tables, but ultimately you get inspired by other people. But you also look towards the fact that I've got other things there that I can use, because I don't necessarily like that bit of e-learning. I want to have some more stuff. And then there are different levels of learners, aren't there? People learn through touching, listening, in-depth study, don't disturb me, with the radio on full blast. They learn in different ways. So I think it's important to provide multiple accesses to content, and e-learning is just one part. Okay, well thanks very much for that. I'm available afterwards. I'm coming back to talk about some of the free support services that we set up to help people with these kind of questions. And also, one of the other things to look at is to actually look at it from, because the whole point of this presentation is about best practice. So what have other companies done, or what have other people done, not necessarily health, but in other areas, where they've commercially applied the concepts of SCORM in order to get efficiency. And I think the key word here is that compliance, and we'll go into what SCORM actually stands for, does give you efficiency, especially when it comes down to course design. And as Jonathan mentioned, one of the things that we're quite kind of au fait with is to actually bring out the best of content, but not to kind of develop content and then develop it again and develop it again, and therefore you've got millions of copies of videos and other things. The whole point of sharing content is that you can spread it across. One of the great parts of John's presentation, that John Wallace's presentation, was the fact that when you come into a portal, there are other periphery bits of information that you need as well. For example, understanding how to use the system. You could have a little video for that, or access to HR information. HR information may not be available in the learning management modules, but it may be something that's kind of more up to date. So you may want to build a portal which has got an RSS feed, which actually updates continuously all the latest information to do with the actual subject area. But I'll come into that later on. So the second thing I'm going to look at is I'm going to look at course design, but with specific examples, and we're going to look at some case studies as well. So that's kind of the format for my presentation, not a million slides. Let's go first of all into SCORM. Now, we can develop a website, anyone can develop a website, and that will contain audio, video, text, image, or it can be flat. But the whole point of this particular SCORM environment was that it was going to be efficient, it was going to be interoperable, which means it could work between one learning management system and another. That's a theory. Okay, so if you've got something like Moodle or you've got OLM, if they're both SCORM compliant and they've been wrapped so that you can actually get the content to move across, then you've only built it once. But we know from using these systems there's a slight bit of tweaking that you need to do. But I think the other thing is about accessibility as well. So I know that a recent project that we did, we actually did under, because he is going to talk about some of the other learning management systems that are out there. But just as a kind of a straw poll, how much are you aware about the kind of SCORM environment? Because I don't want to make this presentation too technical or even kind of too light in terms of what you're actually looking for. I had a quick look at the expectations for people for today, and it seemed to be that it was across the board, that some people knew about SCORM quite well, and some people are in the early stages of getting to understand how to track data and to use it properly. So as a straw poll, are you quite used to kind of the term SCORM? Do you know what it can do? No? No? Okay. All right, okay, wonderful. Okay, that can be a good thing and it can be a bad thing. Okay, so let's carry on. So what I thought I'd do is actually go back a bit and actually explore just very quickly an overview of what SCORM actually is, but really from a practical perspective, rather than give you a technical detail about what opens and what closes when you're actually talking to these particular systems. I'm making a lot of money for other people. Let's see if I can start a company and lose money, or actually try my best to help other people in other ways. So I started up that company, and then Michael and I were talking about 2008 with regards to OLM and getting OLM to work within McKesson and the NHS, and quite honoured to work with some of the people there and wrote some of the documentation. So you can blame me for the fact that if you need to look at your PCT documentation, my name's in there as one of the authors for having to get that thing to work. And I have to say that in the early days it was quite difficult to establish the integration part. That's only because with every project you've got to get your definitions right, and you've got to understand what you're trying to do with it. And we helped out with McKesson and the NHS team, and they've done a great job so far in terms of getting that thing to integrate quite well. Now we are talking about the NHS specifically, which is the ESR program, the Employee Staff Record, which is based on the Oracle system, and Oracle also have OLM, which actually slots in. I won't steal Jonathan's I'd just like to start off by saying just a few words about how this kind of seminar came together really, and a little bit about my background. Michael and I kind of know each other. Michael Knoll, who unfortunately can't be here today, but I've got Michael Donahue, that's at the back, from Oracle. I actually run the company which is KHL Interactive, which was mentioned by Jonathan earlier on. I've done quite a lot of work with OLM, but my kind of background is that I used to be IT manager for Nokia Data, and then I moved on to working for Computer Center. I think there's a couple of people from Computer Center that were supposed to be here. Hi. For about 6 years for my sins at Computer Center. Wonderful company to work for. Great things that you can do in that organization. I did leave to work for a large American company for a few years, and then I thought, well,